International Short Stories, Volume 2, English Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. International Short Stories, Volume 2, English Stories, edited by William Patton. Section 20, A Change of Treatment, by W. W. Jacobs. "Yes, I've sailed under some cute skippers in my time," said the night watchman. "Them that go down in big ships see the wonders of the deep, you know," he added with a sudden chuckle. "But the one I'm going to tell you about ought never to have been trusted out without his ma. A good many of my skippers had fads, but this one was the worst I ever sailed under. It's just some few years ago now. I'd shipped on his bark, the John Elliot, as slow going an old tub as ever I was aboard of, when I wasn't in quite a fit and proper state to know what I was doing, and I hadn't been in her 2 days afore I found out his hobby through overhearing a few remarks made by the second mate, who came up from dinner in a hurry to make 'em. 'I don't mind saws and knives hung round the cabin,' he says to the first mate, 'but when a chap has a 'uman 'and alongside his plate, studying it while folks is at their food, it's more than a Christian man can stand.' 'That's nothing,' says the first mate, who had sailed with the bark afore. 'He's half crazy on doctoring. We nearly had a mutiny aboard once, owing to his wanting to hold a post mortem on a man what fell from the masthead. Wanted to see what the poor feller died of.' 'I call it unwholesome,' says the second mate, very savage. 'He offered me a pill at breakfast the size of a small marble. Quite put me off my feet, it did. Course the skipper's fad soon got known for'ard, but I didn't think much about it till one day I seed old Dan'l Dennis sitting on a locker reading. Every now and then he'd shut the book and look up, closing his eyes and moving his lips like a hen drinking, and then look down at the book again. 'Why, Dan,' I says, 'what's up? You ain't learning lessons at your time of life.' 'Yes, I am,' says Dan, very soft. 'You might hear me say it. It's this one about heart disease.' He hands over the book, which was stuck full of all kinds of diseases, and winks at me hard. 'Picked it up out of book stall,' he says, and then he shut his eyes and said his piece wonderful. It made me feel quite queer to listen to him. 'That's how I feel,' says he, when he'd finished. 'Just strength enough to get to bed. Lend me a hand, Bill, and go fetch the doctor.' Then I see his little game, but I wasn't going to run any risk, so I just mentioned permiscus like to the cook as old Dan seemed rather queer, and went back and tried to borrow the book, being always fond of reading. Old Dan pretended he was too ill to hear what I was saying, and 'fore I could take it away from him the skipper came hurrying down with a bag in his hand. 'What's the matter, my man?' says he. 'What's the matter?' 'I'm all right, sir,' says old Dan, ''cept that I've been swooning away a little.' 'Tell me exactly how you feel,' says the skipper, feeling his pulse. Then old Dan said his piece over to him, and the skipper shook his head and looked very solemn. 'How long have you been like this?' he says. 4 or 5 years, sir,' says Dan. 'It ain't nothing serious, sir, is it?' 'You lie quite still,' says the skipper, putting a little trumpet thing to his chest and then listening. 'There's serious mischief here, I'm afraid. The prognotice is very bad.' 'Prog what, sir?' says Dan, staring. 'Prognotice,' says the skipper. At least I think that's the word he said. 'You keep perfectly still, and I'll go and mix you up a draught, and tell the cook to get some strong beef tea on.' Well, the skipper had no sooner gone than Cornish Harry, a great big lumbering chap, 6 feet 2, goes up to old Dan, and he says, 'Gimme that book.' 'Go away,' says Dan. 'Don't come worrying 'ere. You 'eard the skipper say how bad my prognotice was.' 'You lend me the book,' says Harry, catching hold of him, 'or else I'll bang you first, and split to the skipper arterward. I believe I'm a bit consumptive, anyway. I'm going to see.' He dragged the book away from the old man and began to study. There were so many complaints in it, he was almost tempted to have something else instead of consumption, but he decided on that at last, and he got a cough what worried the fo'c'sle all night long, and the next day, when the skipper came down to see Dan, he could hardly hear hisself speak. "That's a nasty cough you've got there, my man," says he, looking at Harry. "Oh, it's nothing, sir," says Harry, careless like. "I've had it for months now, off and on. I think it's perspiring so of a night does it." "What?" says the skipper. "Do you perspire of a night?" "Dreadful," says Harry. "You could wring the clothes out. I s'pose it's healthy for me, ain't it, sir?" "Undo your shirt," says the skipper, going over to him and sticking the trumpet agin him. "Now take a deep breath. Don't cough." "I can't help it, sir," says Harry. "It will come. Seems to tear me to pieces." "You get to bed at once," says the skipper, taking away the trumpet and shaking his head. "It's a fortunate thing for you, my lad, you're in skilled hands. With care I believe I can pull you round. How does that medicine suit you, Dan?" "Beautiful, sir," says Dan. "It's wonderful soothin'. I slept like a new born babe arter it." "I'll send you to get some more," says the skipper. "You're not to get up, mind, either of you." "All right, sir," says the two in very faint voices, and the skipper went away arter telling us to be careful not to make a noise. We all thought it a fine joke at first, but the airs them two chaps give themselves was something sickening. Being in bed all day, they was naturally wakeful of a night, and they used to call across the forecastle inquiring arter each other's healths, and waking us other chaps up. And they'd swap beef tea and jellies with each other, and Dan 'd try to coax a little port wine out of Harry, which he 'ad to make blood with. But Harry 'ud say he hadn't made enough that day, and he'd drink to the better health of old Dan's prognotice, and smack his lips until it drove us a'most crazy to 'ear him. After these chaps had been ill 2 days, the other fellers began to put their heads together, being maddened by the smell of beef tea and the like, and said they was going to be ill too. And both the invalids got into a fearful state of excitement. "You'll only spoil it for all of us," says Harry, "and you don't know what to have without the book." "It's all very well doing your work as well as our own," says one of the men. "It's our turn now. It's time you two got well." "Well?" says Harry. "Well? Why, you silly ignorant chaps, we shan't never get well. People with our complaints never do. You ought to know that." "Well, I shall split," says one of them. "You do," says Harry. "You do, and I'll put a 'ead on you that all the port wine and jellies in the world wouldn't cure. 'Sides, don't you think the skipper knows what's the matter with us?" Afore the other chaps could reply, the skipper hisself comes down, accompanied by the first mate, with a look on his face which made Harry give the deepest and hollowest cough he'd ever done. "What they reely want," says the skipper, turning to the first mate, "is keerful nussing." "I wish you'd let me nuss 'em," says the first mate. "Only 10 minutes I'd put 'em both on their legs and running for their lives into the bargain in 10 minutes." "Hold your tongue, sir," says the skipper. "What you say is unfeeling, besides being an insult to me. Do you think I studied medicine all these years without knowing when a man's ill?" The first mate growled something and went on deck, and the skipper started examining of 'em again. He said they was wonderfully patient, lying in bed so long, and he had 'em wrapped up in bed clothes and carried on deck, so as the pure air could have a go at 'em. We had to do the carrying, and there they sat, breathing the pure air and looking at the first mate out of the corners of their eyes. If they wanted anything from below, one of us had to go and fetch it, and by the time they was taken down to bed again, we all resolved to be took ill too. Only 2 of 'em did it, though for Harry, who was a powerful ugly tempered chap, swore he'd do all sorts of dreadful things to us if we didn't keep well and hearty, and all 'cept these 2 did. One of 'em, Mike Rafferty, laid up with a swelling on his ribs, which I knew myself he had had for 15 years, and the other chap had paralysis. I never saw a man so reely happy as the skipper was. He was up and down with his medicines and his instruments all day long, and he used to make notes of the cases in a big pocket book and read 'em to the second mate at meal times. The forecastle had been turned into hospital about a week, and I was on deck doing some odd jobs or the other, when the cook comes up to me pulling a face as long as a fiddle. "'Nother invalid," says he. "First mate's gone stark staring mad." "Mad?" says I. "Yes," says he. "He's got a big basin in the galley, and he's laughing like a hyener, and mixing bilge water and ink and paraffin and butter and soap, and all sorts of things up together. The smell's enough to kill a man. I've had to come away. Curious like, I just walked up to the galley and puts my 'ead in, and there was the mate as the cook said, smiling all over his face and ladling some thick sticky stuff into a stone bottle. "How's the poor sufferers, sir?" says he, stepping out of the galley just as the skipper was going by. "They're very bad, but I hope for the best," says the skipper, looking at him hard. "I'm glad to see you're turned a bit more feeling." "Yes, sir," says the mate. "I didn't think so at fust, but I can see now them chaps is all very ill. You'll 'scuse me for saying it, but I don't quite approve of your treatment." I thought the skipper would a bust. "My treatment?" says he. "My treatment? What do you know about it?" "You're treating 'em wrong, sir," says the mate. "I have here," patting the jar, "a remedy which 'ud cure them all if you'd only let me try it." "Pooh!" says the skipper. "One medicine cure all diseases. The old story. What is it? Where'd you get it from?" says he. "I brought the ingredients aboard with me," says the mate. "It's a wonderful medicine discovered by my grandmother, and if I might only try it, I'd thoroughly cure them poor chaps." "Rubbish!" says the skipper. "Very well, sir," says the mate, shrugging his shoulders. "Of course, if you won't let me, you won't. Still, I tell you, if you'd let me try, I'd cure 'em all in 2 days. That's a fair challenge." Well, they talked and talked and talked, until at last the skipper give way and went down below with the mate, and told the chaps they was to take the new medicine for 2 days, just to prove the mate was wrong. "Let poor old Dan try it first, sir," says Harry, starting up and sniffing as the mate took the cork out. "He's been awful bad since you've been away." "Harry's worse than I am, sir," says Dan. "It's only his kind heart that makes him say that." "It don't matter which is fust," says the mate, filling a tablespoon with it. "There's plenty for all. Now, Harry, take it," says the skipper. Harry took it, and the fuss he made, you'd have thought he was swallowing a football. It stuck all round his mouth, and he carried on so dreadful that the other invalids was half sick afore it came to them. By the time the other 3 had 'ad theirs, it was as good as a pantermine, and the mate corked the bottle up and went and sat down on a locker, while they tried to rinse their mouths out with the luxuries which had been given 'em. "How do you feel?" says the skipper. "I'm dying," says Dan. "So am I," says Harry. "I believe the mate's pisoned us." The skipper looks over at the mate very stern, and shakes his head slowly. "It's all right," says the mate. "It's always like that the first dozen or so doses." "Dozen or so doses," says old Dan in a far-away voice. "It has to be taken every 20 minutes," says the mate, pulling out his pipe and lighting it, and the 4 men groaned all together. "I can't allow it," says the skipper. "I can't allow it. Men's lives mustn't be sacrificed for an experiment." "'Tain't an experiment," says the mate, very indignant. "It's an old family medicine." "Well, they shan't have any more," says the skipper firmly. "Look here," says the mate, "if I kill any one of these men, I'll give you £20, honour bright I will." "Make it 25," says the skipper, considering. "Very good," says the mate. 25. I can't say no fairer than that, can I? It's about time for another dose now." He gave 'em all another tablespoon as the skipper left, and the chaps what wasn't invalids nearly bust with joy. He couldn't let 'em have anything to take the taste out, 'cause he said it didn't give the medicine a chance, and he told us other chaps to remove the temptation, and you bet we did. After the 5th dose the invalids began to get desperate, and when they heard they got to be woke up every 20 minutes through the night to take the stuff, they sort of give up. Old Dan said he felt a gentle glow stealing over him and strengthening him, and Harry said that it felt like a healing balm to his lungs. All of 'em agreed it was a wonderful sort of medicine, and arter the 6th dose the man with paralysis dashed up on deck and ran up the rigging like a cat. He sat there for hours spitting and swore he'd brain anybody who interrupted him, and arter a while Mike Rafferty went up and joined him, and if the first mate's ears didn't burn by reason of the things them 2 poor sufferers said about him, they ought to. They was all doing full work the next day, and though, o' course, the skipper saw how he'd been done, he didn't allude to it, not in words, that is. But when a man tries to make 4 chaps do the work of 8, and hits 'em when they don't, it's a easy job to see where the shoe pinches. End of section 20.